At 70 years old, I thought peace was something I had finally earned. I had worked 4 decades as an accountant, raised 2 children, buried 1 husband, and built a quiet life with my second Harold, a man who promised that our twilight years would be gentle. Tonight, under the glitter of chandeliers and crystal glasses, I learned what that promise was worth: exactly $340,000. That was the total amount missing from my retirement account. The discovery didn't come in a storm. It came in a whisper, 1 sentence from my bank manager that rewrote my entire marriage. "Mrs. Bennett, just confirming your withdrawal authorization for the full amount." I remember my hand going cold around the phone, my voice cracking when I said, "What withdrawal?" Now, as the guests toasted our 50th wedding anniversary, I stood in front of them, smiling for the cameras, clutching the silver envelope that contained the evidence of his betrayal. The band played something soft and nostalgic, the kind of music people dance to when they still believe in forever. I didn't. I looked across the room and watched Harold's reflection in the champagne glass, his hand resting on the back of a much younger woman's chair, his wedding ring flashing like an insult under the lights. People said she was his assistant. I had believed it until the night I caught the scent of her perfume on his scarf, a sweet, cheap floral that clung to everything except his conscience. When the photographer asked us to kiss for the anniversary shot, Harold leaned in. I turned my face away just slightly enough that his lips met air. "Smile, darling," he whispered, his voice a performance for the crowd. "We're golden tonight." I smiled back because that was what good wives did. But inside, I was counting every lie. I could almost hear my late husband's voice, the one I'd lost to cancer decades ago, telling me that numbers never lie. Harold's lies were written in digits and decimal points, not in words. Every dollar he took from me was a confession waiting to be heard. After the guests sat down for dinner, I excused myself and walked to the ladies' room. I locked the door, pulled the bank statement from my purse, and stared at it. The numbers glared back at me like a row of tiny, merciless eyes. My name. His signature. My savings gone. The money that was supposed to buy peace healthcare, maybe a modest trip to Italy, the dream of an old woman who still believed in romance, had vanished. I thought about the mornings when he'd told me not to worry about bills, about how he'd wave off my habit of checking receipts, calling it leftover accountant paranoia. I used to laugh with him. Now I realized he had been training me to stop asking questions. I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't tremble. My hair, white as frost, was perfectly pinned, my lipstick unshaken. But behind the surface, something inside me cracked open, a quiet, precise fracture that released 40 years of control. Betrayal doesn't make noise. It's the silence afterward that screams. I opened the stall window slightly just to breathe and heard laughter drifting in from the ballroom. Harold's laughter. Deep, confident, the sound of a man who believed he was untouchable. My fingers tightened around the envelope. He had no idea what was coming. I walked back to the table. The applause died down as I raised my glass. To Harold, I said, my voice calm, steady, almost gentle, for reminding me that love without honesty is just accounting with missing numbers. The crowd chuckled, thinking it was one of my dry jokes. Harold smirked too, only I knew that was the first crack in the mask. I sat down slowly, folded my napkin, and looked him straight in the eye. "We'll need to talk later," I said softly. His smile faltered just a little. "You know, people assume that after 70 women like me become harmless, sweet grandmothers with fading memories and soft voices. They forget that we remember everything. Every check written, every promise made, every penny stolen. Tonight I wasn't a wife. I was an auditor, and the man beside me had just failed the final inspection. If the person you trusted most emptied your life savings for another woman, what would you do? Would you cry? Would you forgive? Or would you build a case strong enough to make sure his next home has bars on the windows, comment one if you'd make him face justice, hit like if you think betrayal deserves no mercy? Because this isn't just a story about a husband's lie. It's about how one woman learned that sometimes the only way to reclaim your dignity is to turn heartbreak into evidence. The morning after the anniversary, I woke up before sunrise. The champagne glasses from last night were still on the counter, tiny bubbles of deceit trapped inside them. Harold was snoring beside me, the sound of a man at peace with his own crimes. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting seconds, waiting for the part of me that still wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. That part never woke up. When he left for his morning jog, a ritual he never missed, I slipped out of bed and went straight to the small oak desk in the study, the one where I used to keep our joint bank documents. The drawer that always resisted a little when pulled open slid out too easily this time. Inside, the folder was gone. My pulse quickened, but my hands stayed steady. I was trained to stay calm under pressure. Accountants don't panic when numbers disappear, they trace them. I turned on the computer. His password hadn't changed in years, the name of his first boat Marigold 1973. The desktop was cleaner than usual, too clean. No spreadsheets, no tax folders, not even his beloved stock tracker app. It looked like someone had just installed the system fresh. I checked the trash bin. Empty. That's when I knew Harold had gone from careless to deliberate. He wasn't just hiding something, he was erasing the trail. But numbers always leave ghosts behind. In the bank portal, the last login came from our home IP address at 2:17 a.m., just 3 nights before the anniversary party. The withdrawal was made at exactly 2:21. I could see the confirmation code, the bank seal, and his signature perfectly curved, a practiced imitation of mine. My throat tightened. He'd done it while I slept. When I closed the laptop, I saw a small receipt under the lamp, half hidden by a book. It was from a jewelry store downtown, dated 2 weeks earlier, totaling $12,000. The item description, custom sapphire pendant engraving included. My anniversary gift from Harold had been a simple gold bracelet, nothing extravagant, just tasteful. He'd told me, "You've never liked flashy things." That pendant hadn't been for me. At breakfast, I pretended everything was normal. I poured coffee, buttered his toast, even asked about his jogging route. He smiled, careless, tired. "You know the usual, down by the lake." I should start timing myself again. I looked at his hands as he talked. His wedding ring had been polished recently. Mine hadn't left my finger in 50 years. "I noticed some withdrawals from our retirement account," I said casually. "Big ones." He didn't look up from the newspaper. "Oh, that he said it's an investment opportunity. Safe, low risk, high yield. You wouldn't understand all the financial jargon." I almost laughed. I was a certified accountant before he even learned to balance a checkbook. But I said nothing. Let him think I was harmless. He folded the paper, neatly kissed my forehead, and left for a client meeting. I waited until his car disappeared, then called the bank manager directly. "Eleanor Bennett here. I need all recent withdrawal documents and authorizations, digital and physical." The woman on the other end hesitated. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Bennett, but Mr. Bennett requested to be the sole contact for the account now. He brought a letter signed by you." The words cut deep, but my voice stayed calm. "Could you send me a copy of that letter?" She promised to email it. When the file arrived, I printed it and stared at the signature. My name, my handwriting. Perfect. Almost. He'd used an older version of my signature, the one I'd stopped using 15 years ago, before arthritis made my loops smaller. That night I went through his office again, but this time I found something. Beneath a pile of gardening magazines was a crumpled envelope marked "Confidential." Inside were receipts, hotel bookings, restaurant bills, wire transfers to a woman named Rebecca S. Lawson. The same name printed on a jewelry store invoice. The dates lined up exactly with the missing funds. I sat on the floor surrounded by proof of my own foolishness, and for the first time in decades I didn't feel like an accountant or a wife. I felt like a client who had just realized she'd been robbed by the person she hired to protect her. The phone rang. "Harold, you still up, sweetheart?" His voice was warm, casual, rehearsed. "Just reviewing old files," I said, staring at the mountain of receipts. "You know me can't sleep until every number balances." He laughed. "That's my Ellie. You worry too much. We're fine." Then he added softly, "Don't check the retirement account for a while, okay? Some transactions are pending." "Of course," I said, and hung up. In the silence that followed, I heard my mother's voice clear, as if she were standing beside me. She'd always said, "The easiest way to catch a liar is to let him keep talking." So I decided to let Harold talk, and I would listen. I would listen until his lies hung themselves. By dawn, I had scanned every receipt and saved copies to a flash drive. Then I called my oldest friend, Martha, who worked at the same bank branch for 30 years. "Martha," I whispered, "I think Harold forged my signature." There was a long pause on the line. "Oh, Ellie," she said finally, her voice trembling, "I was afraid of that." I froze. "You knew," she sighed. "He came in 6 months ago with documents claiming you'd given him power of attorney. The form looked wrong, but he said you were sick, that you'd asked him to handle everything." I could hear the shame in her tone. "I should have called you, but he brought a doctor's note." "What doctor?" I asked. "A Dr. Phillips. We never met him before." My heart pounded. There was no Dr. Phillips. Harold had forged that too. Martha promised to check the internal logs and send me copies quietly. Be careful, she warned. If he realizes you're onto him, he might move the rest of the money. I thanked her and hung up, my mind racing. I went to the bedroom. Harold was asleep again, his mouth slightly open, the faint sound of a snore that used to comfort me. I watched him for a long time and thought, how strange that someone can look so peaceful while their soul rots inside them. I slipped the flash drive under the lining of my jewelry box. As I closed it, I noticed something glittering among my rings, a receipt tag with Rebecca's initials printed on it. She must have the pendant now. My retirement had bought another woman's sparkle. When Harold woke, I was already dressed, hair done, coffee brewed. "You're up early," he said, rubbing his eyes. "Just couldn't sleep," I replied, handing him his cup, thinking about our future. He smiled, oblivious, and I thought of all the futures he'd stolen from me, the trips I'd never take, the garden I'd never finish, the quiet I'd never know again. He kissed my cheek and left for another meeting. As soon as the door clicked shut, I turned on my computer and began a new spreadsheet. Title: Fraudulent Transactions, subject Harold Bennett. The accountant in me was back from retirement, and this time she wasn't balancing books. She was building a case. 3 days passed before Martha called again. I was in the garden trimming roses when her voice came through the phone, low and urgent. "Ellie, you need to sit down." I did, right there on the damp grass, shears still in my hand. I checked the internal records. The withdrawals didn't stop at the retirement account. He opened 2 additional savings accounts under your name's secondary identification, verified by that same fake doctor. I gripped the handle of the shears until my knuckles whitened. "How much?" "Another 115,000, she whispered, "and he's been transferring it in smaller amounts to someone named R. Lawson. The transfers are labeled as home care reimbursement." Rebecca again. Home care. The irony burned. The only care I needed now was revenge. When I hung up, I just sat there, the wind teasing the hem of my cardigan, the sound of distant traffic blending with the thud of my heartbeat. Harold was meticulous, I'll give him that. He'd built a system so neat that any outsider would think I was the one spending carelessly. And maybe that was his plan, to paint me as senile, confused, losing track of my own money. I thought of the way he'd been hovering lately, taking my car keys, reminding me of my pills, gently calling me forgetful. That word forgetful suddenly sounded like a loaded gun. That evening, he came home with takeout from my favorite restaurant. "You didn't have to cook tonight," he said, setting the boxes on the table with exaggerated cheer. "You've been looking so tired lately. Maybe you should see a doctor." My stomach turned. "What kind of doctor?" I asked, watching his face. "Someone good," he said too quickly. "I'll make the appointment for you. You just rest." I smiled, pretending gratitude, but inside I was calculating. Every word was evidence, every gesture was manipulation. I kept my voice calm. "You're sweet, Harold, always looking out for me." He kissed my cheek again, the same mechanical affection he gave to the neighbor's dog, and left the room humming. I stood there staring at his untouched dinner. Somewhere between the first bite and the lie about my memory, I realized he wasn't just trying to take my money. He was trying to take my credibility. The next morning, I met Martha at a quiet diner on the edge of town. She brought a manila folder tucked inside her purse and slid it across the table like we were in some noir film. "Internal logs, forged authorizations, transaction slips," she said. "Be careful. If he figures out someone at the bank helped you, he'll come after me." "He won't," I assured her. "He still thinks I'm asleep." Inside the folder, I found copies of letters with my forged signature, each one granting him permission to handle my finances due to declining cognitive function. My chest tightened. He hadn't just stolen my money. He'd built a paper trail to make me look incompetent. I flipped through the pages and saw the name Dr. Philip Hansen, an invented physician whose clinic address belonged to an abandoned storefront. I whispered, "He really thought of everything." Martha reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "He's been coming into the branch for months, Ellie, charming everyone, always with that smile, always dropping your name like a saint. People believed him. They always do," I said bitterly. Harold could charm a wolf out of its own fur. A memory came flooding back, our first year together after my first husband's death. He'd shown up at the community center, volunteering for the senior tax help program. I remembered his hand resting on mine over the calculator, the warmth of it, the way he'd said, "You deserve someone who takes care of details so you don't have to." I had laughed, thinking it was romantic. Now I knew it had been a prophecy. Back at home, I found new locks on the filing cabinet. "Safety reasons," Harold explained that evening. "I don't want you misplacing anything important." I played along, nodding slowly, but the insult stung. He had me right where he wanted me, appearing confused, dependent, and quiet. He started reminding me of bills I'd already paid, moved my reading glasses, rearranged files, even reset the microwave clock so I'd think I'd lost track of time. Small things, but deliberate. That's how gaslighting works. It makes you doubt your own arithmetic until you stop counting. One night I caught him whispering on the phone in the study. I listened from the hallway. "She's starting to slip," he murmured. "A few more weeks and the transfer will be complete. I'll bring the rest to you in person." I recognized Rebecca's name when he ended the call. "Good night, darling." He never called me that anymore. Later I confronted him softly. "Who were you talking to?" He blinked, startled, then recovered with a smile. "Just the insurance company. You must have misheard. You really should get your hearing checked, Ellie." He said it gently, like a nurse soothing a patient. I turned away before he could see my hands shaking. The next day, I visited our son Michael. I needed to see if Harold had started poisoning him too. Michael looked uneasy when I brought up the missing money. "Mom, Dad told me you've been under a lot of stress," he said carefully. "He said you've been forgetting things, getting paranoid. Maybe it's time you two got some help." His words hit like stones. My own child thought I was losing my mind. I forced a smile, masking the ache in my chest. "You're right, dear," I said quietly. "Maybe I do need help." That night I didn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching the walls we'd painted together, the photographs lining the hallway, each one now a monument to deceit. Every smile in those frames was a lie frozen in time. I poured myself a glass of water, but the reflection in the kitchen window stopped me cold. Harold's car wasn't in the driveway. It was 1:00 a.m. I peeked through the blinds and saw headlights at the end of the street. He was there, parked, talking on the phone, laughing. The laughter that used to make me feel safe now made my skin crawl. By dawn I had a plan. I called Martha again. "I need an official notarized statement that those authorizations were forged," I said, "and I need it dated." She hesitated. "Ellie, that's serious. So is theft and fraud," I said. "If I don't start protecting myself, he'll have me declared incompetent before the month ends." I hung up and made a list on a yellow pad bank: evidence, forged letters, fake doctor witness statement. 4 steps, 4 nails in Harold's coffin. I tucked the list inside my diary, the same diary he once gave me for our 10th anniversary, embossed with gold letters that read, "For the love of my life." How poetic. I would use his own gift to bury him. That evening he came home earlier than usual, smelling of expensive cologne. "You look lovely tonight," he said. "Let's go out to dinner." I stared at him, wondering which lie he would wear this time. "I'm tired," I replied. "You go ahead." He smiled. "Suit yourself. Don't wait up." When his car disappeared into the night, I opened the safe under the stairs. Inside were our tax records untouched. I pulled out the oldest one from our first joint return. In the section marked signatures, mine was identical to the one on the forged documents. He'd kept samples for years, collecting, practicing, waiting. That realization sent a cold rush through me, equal parts horror and clarity. Harold hadn't changed. He had been patient, and I had been convenient. The next morning, I received Martha's notarized statement in the mail, sealed and official. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. The mask was slipping on his side and mine was just beginning to form. Harold thought he'd built a perfect story about a fragile old woman losing her mind. He had no idea that the woman he underestimated was already writing the ending. The following weeks moved like fog, thick, quiet, and hard to breathe through. Harold had grown bolder, certain that his act of gentle concern was working. Every conversation began with, "You've been so forgetful lately," or "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll take care of that." He'd started handling all the mail, claiming he didn't want me confused by the paperwork. One afternoon, I found him standing in the kitchen, sifting through my prescriptions. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled. "Just checking expiration dates. You mixed them up last month." I hadn't. I knew exactly what he was doing, laying the groundwork to make me look incompetent. Gaslighting doesn't arrive in one explosion. It comes in teaspoons, stirred quietly into your morning coffee until you no longer recognize its taste. He began changing routines I'd followed for decades. The clock in the living room ran 10 minutes fast. The car keys disappeared, then reappeared in the freezer. My favorite sweater went missing, only to turn up folded neatly in the laundry basket. Each small confusion chipped away at my confidence. Every time I confronted him, he feigned patience. "You see, this is why I'm worried about you. I started writing everything down, dates, times, details. It became my secret logbook, the proof that I wasn't losing my mind. He was trying to take it from me. Michael came by more often, which should have been comforting, but it wasn't. His eyes carried the cautious pity reserved for those losing their grip on reality. "Dad says you've been stressed," he told me one Sunday, helping himself to coffee. "Maybe a doctor could help, Mom." I smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You know me, I document everything." He chuckled uneasily. "That's what worries us. You've been obsessed with records lately. Records, evidence, proof." He didn't understand that obsession was the only thing keeping me sane. That evening, I overheard Harold on the phone again, his voice low but confident. "She's almost ready for the evaluation," he said. "Once the report comes through, I'll get full control. Yes, I'll bring the documents to the lawyer next week." My blood went cold. The evaluation he was planning to have me declared mentally unfit. The law would hand him everything I owned neatly and legally. I pressed my ear closer to the door, barely breathing. He paused, then said, "Don't worry, Rebecca. Soon we'll have all the time in the world." When he hung up, I went straight to my diary and wrote every word. The next day I visited Martha again, asking if she could verify whether any legal appointments had been scheduled in my name. "Give me 24 hours, she said. The following morning she called back, her voice trembling. "Ellie, he's already filed preliminary paperwork for guardianship. It claims you've been diagnosed with early-onset dementia. There's even a statement from Dr. Hansen." My hands shook as I gripped the phone. "That man doesn't exist." "I know," she whispered. "But the court doesn't." That night, Harold poured me wine, my favorite red, though I hadn't seen him buy it in months. "To us," he said, raising his glass. I watched the deep crimson swirl and thought about all the subtle ways poison can look like love. I only pretended to sip. He smiled, satisfied, his reflection rippling in the wine glass. "You've been so quiet lately," he said. "Maybe you're finally relaxing." I smiled faintly. Maybe I am. Inside, I was memorizing every detail, the date, the hour, the way he looked relieved when I pretended to drink. The next morning I woke with a dull ache in my temples, though I hadn't touched the wine. I suspected he'd tampered with my sleeping pills. My suspicion turned to certainty when I found an empty capsule under the bed, split open, powder missing. He'd been grinding them, controlling my dosage. That was the moment I stopped being afraid. Fear is heavy, and once you put it down, you realize it was the only thing holding you still. That afternoon, I called Detective Roy, the same man who'd once helped our church committee recover stolen funds decades ago. "Roy, it's Eleanor Bennett," I said. "I need advice." He remembered me instantly. "The accountant who caught the embezzler in '93, he said with a chuckle. "What's the problem this time?" "My husband," I answered. The laughter died. "What kind of problem? Financial, criminal, possibly medical?" We met in a small diner off the highway, the kind of place where nobody asks questions. I showed him the flash drive, the notarized statement from Martha, the forged letters. His jaw tightened as he scrolled through the files. "You've got yourself a hell of a case, Eleanor," he said. He's methodical. "This isn't just fraud, it's premeditated identity theft." "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" "I'm too old not to be ready," I said. Back home, I began recording everything. I set my phone to capture his conversations, my pen to document his every move. Every time he called me forgetful, every time he adjusted my medication, every time he spoke Rebecca's name, it went into the file. The accountant in me was awake again, and this time the balance sheet would end in justice. A week later, the confrontation I dreaded arrived unexpectedly. Michael dropped by unannounced with a woman in a gray suit, a social worker. "Mom, this is Claire," he said softly. "Dad asked her to check in on you." I glanced at Harold, who stood behind them, hands folded like a benevolent caretaker. "He's worried about you," Michael added. I nodded slowly. "Of course he is." Claire asked polite questions. Did I feel confused lately? Had I misplaced important items? Did I ever get lost while driving? Harold answered half of them for me, every sentence dripping with false compassion. "She's been under a lot of pressure," he said. "Sometimes she gets things mixed up." I met her eyes steady. "Do I seem confused to you, Miss Claire?" She hesitated. "No, ma'am, you seem precise." "Good," I said, "because I record everything, dates, times, transactions. Would you like to see my documentation?" Harold stiffened. "Ellie, that's not necessary." "It's perfectly necessary," I interrupted. "If someone's questioning my mind, they should see how clearly it works." I opened the drawer and pulled out my logbook, thick with notes. The social worker skimmed a page, her expression tightening. Mr. Bennett, did you authorize a transfer of $15,000 to R. Lawson last week? His face went pale. That's business-related, he said quickly. Rebecca Lawson is my client. Then why, I asked, did you use my authorization code silence? Claire looked between us uncomfortable. I think I've seen enough, she said quietly, and excused herself. Harold followed her to the door, his voice low, desperate. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught fragments, misunderstanding, overreaction, age. When she left, he turned to me, the mask cracked for the first time. You're making a fool of yourself, he hissed. You're losing it, Eleanor. Everyone sees it. No, I said evenly, I'm making a record of it. For 3 days, he avoided me. Then late Friday night, I heard the garage door open. I peeked through the window and saw him loading suitcases into the trunk of his car. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and hit record. He was on the phone again, pacing. Yes, I have it all. She won't notice until next week. I'll transfer the last funds before the lawyer files the papers. Then we're gone. I followed him quietly down the driveway, staying in the shadows until he hung up. Going somewhere, I asked. He froze, keys in hand. For a moment, he looked almost human, caught vulnerable. Then he laughed. Just business, Ellie. Go back inside. You mean Rebecca's business? His jaw twitched. Don't be ridiculous. Then why, I said softly, is your suitcase full of my financial statements? He didn't answer. He just stared at me, eyes calculating, and for the first time I saw the stranger behind the husband. The silence between us stretched thin as glass. Finally, he said, You've really lost it, climbed into the car and drove off into the dark. I stood there under the porch light phone, still recording the night air cold against my skin. He thought he was escaping. He didn't realize he'd just handed me everything I needed. The morning after Harold disappeared with his suitcases, I didn't call him. I didn't panic. I simply waited for the silence to tell me where he'd gone. By noon it did. Martha called from her office, her voice sharp. Ellie, you were right. One of my clerks saw him at the Lakeshore Resort checking in under your name. I felt the air leave my lungs in one slow exhale. Did he book it for long, I asked. A week. And he paid cash. I hung up and stood in the kitchen, staring at the refrigerator door covered with photos, birthdays, graduations, the little fragments of a family that no longer existed. Every smile in those pictures was counterfeit now. I packed a single overnight bag, slipped my phone charger and notebook inside, and left the house without locking the door. There was nothing left in that house worth stealing. The drive to Lake Shore took 2 hours. The rain followed me most of the way, streaking the windshield in gray ribbons. My wipers kept the rhythm of my heartbeat steady, controlled, relentless. By the time I reached the resort, the clouds had thinned into a watery sunset. Couples strolled along the boardwalk, holding hands, sipping wine. It was the kind of place Harold used to say we'd retire to someday. How poetic that he'd chosen it for his betrayal. I parked 2 blocks away and walked along the marina. The water shimmered pink and gold, a deceptive beauty masking deep filth beneath, like Harold, I thought. I spotted his car immediately, the same silver sedan we'd bought 10 years ago. The trunk was open slightly, revealing the corner of my file box, the one that used to sit under our desk at home. He'd taken it. My savings, my records, my past, all stuffed in the back of a car parked outside a lover's getaway. I checked into a motel across the street under my maiden name. That night I sat by the window watching the resort lights glitter across the water. At 9:07 p.m. I saw him. Harold stepped out onto a balcony 2 floors above the restaurant patio. He wore the same gray suit from our anniversary dinner, but the jacket looked too small now, strained by arrogance. Beside him stood a woman in a red dress, her hair loose, her laugh sharp enough to pierce the night air. Rebecca Lawson. She leaned into him, her hand sliding down his arm. He poured her champagne. I zoomed my phone camera in and hit record. The image was grainy in the dark, but clear enough to see him kiss her. For a moment, my heart clenched, not with jealousy, but with disbelief that I had ever shared a life with that man. Every morning coffee, every whispered promise, every I love you was suddenly an equation that never balanced. I whispered to myself, that's where my retirement went. I stayed awake all night going over every receipt, every note, every recording. I pieced together the timeline like an investigator reconstructing a crime scene, which it was. At 3 a.m., I poured the last of the motel's bitter coffee and stared at the pages spread before me. Harold's empire of lies stretched across the bed in neat rows of evidence. It looked almost beautiful in its precision, like the perfect ledger of a perfect thief. In the early morning light, I walked to the boardwalk. The resort was quiet except for the gulls crying overhead. I saw Harold again, this time in the lobby, checking his phone. Rebecca stood beside him wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. They looked like a couple posing for a brochure, wealthy, carefree, entitled. I followed them at a distance as they walked to a nearby cafe. They sat outside sharing pancakes. I heard her laugh as she said, "So when do we get the rest?" And Harold replied, "Soon. Once the last transfer clears, we'll disappear." Disappear? The word lodged itself in my mind like a stone. That was his plan, to vanish with my money, my name, and my sanity neatly buried behind a legal guardianship. But he hadn't counted on my persistence. When they finished breakfast, Harold left briefly to take a call. Rebecca scrolled through her phone, frowning. Then she froze, staring at something on the screen. A message from an unknown number had popped up. My message. I had sent it 5 minutes earlier. Nice pendant. Shame it's bought with stolen money. I watched from the cafe window as she looked around nervously. When Harold returned, she stood abruptly, whispering something that made him pale. He scanned the crowd. His eyes brushed past me once, then again not recognizing the woman with short gray hair and dark sunglasses. He muttered something to Rebecca, who shook her head violently and walked off toward the parking lot. He tried to grab her arm, but she yanked free. The performance was over. I slipped out before they saw me and followed her to the parking lot. "Rebecca," I said quietly. She turned, startled. Up close, she looked younger than I expected, mid-30s, frightened, tired. "Who are you?" she demanded. "The woman whose life you just helped destroy," I said. Her lips parted, speechless. I handed her a small envelope. "Inside is proof that the money Harold's been giving you isn't from a trust fund. It's my retirement, my signature, my life." She opened the envelope and skimmed the documents, her face draining of color. "He told me you were sick," she whispered. "He said you didn't even know. He says a lot of things," I replied. "But if you don't want to be part of this anymore, you'll help me." She looked torn, then nodded slowly. "What do you need?" I smiled faintly. Just honesty, and maybe a little justice. That afternoon, Rebecca met me at my motel. Over cups of watery coffee, she confessed everything. Harold had told her I was his sister-in-law, that he managed my finances because I was mentally declining. He'd promised her a new life in Florida using family money that would be free once he finalized the paperwork. She showed me their messages, photos, wire transfers, even a draft email to his lawyer arranging the final withdrawal. Every lie he'd told her became another nail in his coffin. I recorded her statement, printed copies of her messages, and added them to my growing file. When she left, she hesitated at the door. "He's dangerous when he feels cornered," she warned. "Be careful, I'm counting on that," I said. That night, Harold called me for the first time in days. "Ellie, darling," he began, his voice sugar-coated panic. "Where are you? I've been worried sick." I almost laughed. "I'm sure you have," I said. "How's the resort?" Silence. Then a nervous chuckle. "What resort? The one where you kissed your client on the balcony last night. I hope the champagne was worth $340,000. He exhaled sharply. "Ellie, listen, it's not what you think." "Save it," I said. "I have recording statements and a notarized affidavit from your bank. You're finished." He was quiet for a moment, then his voice hardened. "You wouldn't dare. You'll ruin both of us." "No," I said calmly, "just you." He hung up, but I could almost feel the fear on the other end of the line. That was when I decided this wouldn't end in shouting or tears. It would end in order documentation and silence, the language he had underestimated all along. The next morning, I met with Detective Roy again. I laid the new evidence on the table, including Rebecca's testimony. He studied it carefully, nodding. "You've done half my job for me," he said. "You sure you want to go through with this? Once it starts, there's no going back." "I'm 70, I said. "The only thing I don't have time for is cowardice." As I left the station, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in weeks. I thought about the word retirement. People think it means peace, rest, quiet. But for me, it had become a declaration of war, a war fought with balance sheets and truth. Harold had built a perfect lie, but he'd forgotten the first rule of accounting. Eventually, every debt demands payment, and I intended to collect every cent with interest. When I came back home from the lakeshore, the house looked smaller, as if the lies had been holding up the walls. I walked through each room, carefully turning on the lights one by one, letting the silence settle. Every trace of Harold was still there. His coat on the chair, his razor on the sink, the half-empty mug beside the bed. But now I saw those things for what they were, evidence left by a man who thought he'd never be caught. The next morning I called Roy. It's time I told him. He met me at the cafe 2 blocks from my house, the same one where Harold and I used to have breakfast on Sundays. Roy was still the same steady observant, the kind of man who didn't waste words. "You have enough for an arrest," he said after scanning my files, "but I think you want something more." I nodded. I want the truth to happen where it began, in front of everyone who believed his lies. We started planning. Roy would contact the district attorney, quietly ensure that a warrant was ready the moment Harold confirmed the transfers. Rebecca agreed to cooperate fully. She'd already cut contact with him, claiming she needed time to think. Her messages would draw him out. At home, I began preparing my own stage. Harold had planned a second celebration dinner, our postponed golden anniversary. He called it pretending it was an apology for leaving so suddenly. I told him through text that I forgave him, that I wanted one last night together. He took the bait immediately. "We'll invite the family," he wrote, "make it right." I typed back, "Perfect." The following week was a strange calm. The town moved at its usual pace, but inside me something was building, a pressure, a quiet storm gathering under my ribs. Every morning I checked my notes, added new details, rehearsed what I would say. I cleaned the house until it gleamed, not out of habit, but ritual. Cleansing before execution. 2 days before the dinner, Roy and his tech partner came by with a small black case. "Hidden cameras," he explained. "One in the lamp, one near the mantel, another under the dining table. They'll capture sound and movement. You'll have visual proof of every word." I helped them place each one, hands steady, as if I'd done this all my life. "I want him to see himself," I said. "I want him to hear how he sounds when he lies." That night I sat at my desk writing a letter. It began simply, "To the man who mistook kindness for weakness." I didn't know if I'd give it to Harold or leave it for the judge. It was less a letter than an obituary for the person I'd once been, the trusting wife, the quiet homemaker. She had died somewhere between the forged signatures and the red dress on that balcony. What replaced her was something sharper. The next day, Rebecca sent me screenshots of her renewed conversation with Harold. I told him I missed him. She said over the phone, her voice uneasy, "He says he's wrapping things up with you and that we'll finally be free." I could hear the disgust under her words. "Keep him talking," I told her. "He'll trap himself if he thinks he's safe." By Friday, everything was in motion. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening. Harold had called our son invited. Martha even reached out to some old friends, spinning the story that we'd had a misunderstanding. I smiled when I heard that phrase. Misunderstanding was a small word for theft. He still thought this was about embarrassment, not justice. Saturday morning came cold and clear. I woke early, brewed strong coffee, and ironed the blue dress I hadn't worn in years. I chose it because Harold always said it made me look too serious. That was the point. At noon, Roy called. "Everything's set. The team will be stationed nearby. Once he confirms the wire transfer, we move." I thanked him. He hesitated before hanging up. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "you're doing the right thing. I'm doing the necessary thing," I replied. By 5, the house was lit and warm. The table was set with china from our wedding silver, polished until it gleamed. Martha arrived first, holding a bottle of wine. "You look different," she said softly, "like someone who knows the ending." "Maybe I do," I said. Michael and his wife came next, uneasy but smiling, unaware of what they were walking into. And then at 6:30, Harold arrived. He looked immaculate, new suit, new haircut, same practiced charm. "You look beautiful, Ellie," he said, kissing my cheek. His cologne was heavier tonight, almost suffocating. "Let's make this a night to remember," I smiled. "Oh, it will be." Dinner began smoothly. The guests talked, laughed, filled plates. Harold poured wine and told stories, slipping into the role of devoted husband with ease. When he reached for my hand across the table, I let him take it. His palm was damp. He was nervous. Good. Halfway through the meal, he cleared his throat. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, standing. "This past year has been challenging for us, but Ellie and I have worked through it. Tonight we're starting fresh. And to show my commitment, I've arranged something special." He took out his phone, opened an email, and pressed send. My phone buzzed in my purse. The notification flashed on the screen. "Transfer confirmation $75,000 to R. Lawson." The room went still. I looked up at him slowly. "What was that, Harold?" His smile faltered. "Just business," he said. "A refund. You wouldn't understand." "Try me." My voice was quiet, measured. He hesitated, eyes darting to our guests. "Ellie, let's not do this here. No, I said, standing. Here is exactly right. I reached for the remote and pressed play. The living room TV flickered to life, showing footage from the resort balcony, the kiss, the champagne, his promise to disappear. Gasps filled the room. Harold's face went white. What is this? He stammered. Evidence, I said. Collected, dated, verified. Roy stepped through the doorway, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Harold Bennett, he said clearly, you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and financial coercion. Harold turned toward me, disbelief twisting his face. You set me up. No, I said calmly. You set the table. I just invited the truth to dinner. As the officers read him his rights, Martha reached for my hand. Michael stood frozen, watching his father lead away, the sound of handcuffs clicking louder than any word in the room. I felt strangely peaceful. The storm that had been building inside me for months finally broke, not in thunder but in order. Outside, red and blue lights flashed across the windows. The guests murmured, stunned. I walked to the table, lifted my untouched wine glass, and said quietly, "To honesty." Later that night, after everyone had gone, I sat alone in the living room. The silence was different now, clean. The cameras were off, the evidence sealed. I looked at the chair where Harold had been sitting hours earlier and felt nothing. No grief, no triumph, just relief. When Roy called to say Harold had confessed, I only said, "Of course he did. He's always been good with numbers." I hung up, looked around my empty house, and whispered, "Debt settled." The house was still and waiting, every light dimmed to a golden hush. Dinner was in an hour, and I could hear the faint sound of the rain starting outside, the kind that falls softly like a warning whispered against the windows. I had dressed early, my hair pinned neatly, the blue dress smoothing over my knees as I sat in the living room with the folder on my lap. Every page inside it was a heartbeat of the last year, forged documents, wire confirmations, Rebecca's testimony, and the photos from Lake Shore. Together they told the story of a man who had confused trust with weakness. Harold came home earlier than expected. I heard his car in the driveway, the quick tap of shoes on the porch, and then the sound of keys in the lock. He stepped in, shaking off the drizzle, looking almost boyish in his gray suit. "You're ready early," he said, flashing that polished smile that used to melt every doubt. "You know me, I said I like to be prepared." He walked over and kissed the air near my cheek, his cologne heavy with nervousness. "Big night," he said. "We'll make it count." He glanced around, scanning the table, the decorations, the candles waiting to be lit. "You've outdone yourself, Ellie. I knew we could get past all that nonsense." "All what nonsense?" I asked, still sitting, my voice calm, curious. He hesitated, a small crack in the charm. "You know those little misunderstandings. The money, the bank confusion, all of it." I looked at him carefully, and for a moment I almost admired the ease with which he lied. The man could sell ice to the Arctic. "You're right," I said, softly, standing. "We should clear those little misunderstandings before everyone arrives." He blinked. "Now?" "Yes, now." I walked past him into the study, the room where we used to do our taxes, where the smell of paper and coffee had once meant trust. I turned on the lamp. The folder lay open on the desk, pages fanned like a deck of cards. Harold followed his shoes, clicking against the hardwood floor. "Ellie, can't this wait?" he said lightly. "You'll ruin your makeup." "I don't wear makeup for liars," I said, and he froze. The words hung there, sharp, deliberate. I turned the first page toward him, the letter of power of attorney with my forged signature. "You remember this, don't you?" He looked down, then forced a smile. "It's just paperwork. I must have mixed up the forms." "You mixed them up 6 times, I said, flipping to the next page. "All with the same doctor's note, all notarized by a ghost. Dr. Philip Hansen, he doesn't exist, Harold." His face flickered, composure faltering. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. I was managing our finances. You've been so stressed." "Stop," I said quietly. The sound was low, but it silenced him. "You weren't managing anything. You were draining me, bit by bit, while telling the world I was slipping into dementia." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. The color drained from his face. "Who told you that?" "Our son, my friend at the bank. And you every time you hit a bill or moved my glasses or changed the clocks." His eyes darted toward the door. "Ellie, you're tired. You don't know what you're saying." "Don't patronize me," I said, my voice rising. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I know that you emptied our retirement, that you forged my name, and that you kissed Rebecca Lawson on a balcony while calling her your client." He flinched, a quick tightening around his mouth. "You followed me." "I documented you," I said, "because that's what accountants do. They follow the numbers." He tried to laugh, but it broke halfway through. "So what? You'll call the police. You'll ruin both of us over a misunderstanding." "There's that word again," I murmured. "No, Harold, I won't ruin us. You did that already." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over the desk. "You think anyone will believe you?" he hissed. "You're old, Eleanor. Forgetful. Half the town already thinks you're losing it. You start throwing around accusations and they'll lock you in a care home before they arrest me." I looked up at him and for the first time I smiled. "You're right," I said softly. "They won't just believe me. They'll watch you prove it yourself." He blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes. I glanced toward the lamp. The hidden camera's tiny red light was blinking, recording every word. "You really should stop underestimating me," I said. "It's terrible for your health." His jaw clenched. "What have you done?" "What you should have expected," I said. "I've spent months listening to you tell me I'm too fragile to understand numbers. But numbers never lie. People do. And you've been lying for so long you can't even tell the difference anymore." He slammed his hand on the desk, leaning in close. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Yes," I said calmly, "I do. I'm dealing with a man who's terrified of being seen." He exhaled, his breath sharp with whiskey. "You're bluffing. You have nothing." "Funny thing about bluffs," I said, sliding the folder toward him. "They only work if the other person hasn't already seen your hand." He reached for the papers, but I caught his wrist. His pulse thudded against my fingers. "You forged my name. You took my money. You used my love as cover. And you thought age would make me harmless." I leaned closer, my voice steady, cutting through his silence. "You made one mistake. Harold, you taught me too well. You taught me that everything leaves a trace." For the first time in our marriage, he looked frightened. Not angry, not guilty, just scared. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the rain tapping at the window. Finally, he straightened his jacket, forcing composure back onto his face. "You won't do anything," he said. "You've always needed me. You wouldn't survive without me." "Try me," I whispered. He turned sharply and left the study, slamming the door behind him. I listened to his footsteps retreat down the hall, each one echoing like a countdown. When the front door opened and closed, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The lamplight hummed softly beside me. I reached over, turned the camera off, and whispered to the empty room, "That's one confession down." Then I closed the folder, smoothed my dress, and walked upstairs to fix my hair for dinner. The storm outside had grown heavier, but my hands didn't shake. Everything was in place. Every lie had been documented, every secret timed. In less than an hour, the guests would arrive. And by the time the candles were lit, Harold's freedom would already be over. The guests arrived one by one, their voices warm and unsuspecting as coats were hung, wine uncorked, laughter spilling through the house like a familiar song. I moved among them calmly, my every motion deliberate, rehearsed. Martha stood near the kitchen island, quiet but watchful. She knew what was coming. Roy was outside, waiting in his car across the street, the warrant sealed and ready. The cameras hummed softly in their hiding spots, red lights blinking invisibly. Harold entered last. He carried a bouquet of lilies, my least favorite flowers, and a bottle of champagne. "To new beginnings," he said cheerfully, handing them to me, as if the last hour in the study hadn't happened. His face was smooth, too smooth, like glass stretched over panic. "Thank you," I said, taking the flowers. "They'll look perfect on the table." We all sat down the table, glowing under candlelight. Harold dominated the conversation, spinning charm as easily as silk. "Ellie's the backbone of this family," he announced to our son and daughter-in-law. "She's always been the practical one. You know, I don't say it enough, but this woman saved me." I smiled and nodded, though my hands were folded tightly in my lap. After dinner, he stood and raised his glass. 50 years, he said. "That's half a century of love, forgiveness, and learning to laugh at life's mistakes." His gaze flicked toward me. "And to prove I've learned my lesson, I have one last surprise." He pulled out his phone. "A little gift just processed today. I transferred some money to an investment for Ellie, our future." I felt the vibration in my purse before he even finished. A new notification flashed on my screen. "Transfer confirmation $75,000 to R. Lawson." The room stilled. The laughter faded. I stood slowly, setting my glass down so gently the sound of it touching the table was louder than his entire speech. "A future for who, Harold?" I asked. He blinked, forcing a laugh. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath and let the silence gather. "For Rebecca Lawson, perhaps." Michael frowned. "Dad, what's going on?" Harold's smile trembled but held. "Just business, son. Nothing unusual." "Then you won't mind if I show everyone I said." I lifted the small remote from my pocket and pressed play. The television in the corner came to life, the light flickering across every shocked face in the room. The screen showed Harold on the balcony at Lakeshore, Rebecca beside him in her red dress, his arm wrapped around her waist, his voice unmistakable. "Once the last transfer clears, we'll disappear." A gasp broke from Martha. My son turned pale. Harold's hand jerked toward the remote, but I was faster. I stepped between him and the screen. "Don't," I said quietly. "You've had your turn to talk." He looked around, his voice rising. "This is ridiculous. She's twisting things. That woman means nothing to me." Martha's voice cut through the tension. "Then why are you paying her with Ellie's money?" He froze, every muscle in his face tightening. "You don't know what you're talking about." "But I didn't give him the chance to recover. You forged my signature, Harold," I said, the words slicing cleanly through the room. "You fabricated a doctor, you built fake accounts, and you drained every dollar of my savings into her hands. You told the world I was losing my mind, but the only one who's lost anything here is you." He slammed his fist against the table, the candles shaking, wine spilling like blood across the linen. "You want to ruin me," he shouted. "You'll destroy this family." "No," I said. "You did that the moment you chose deceit over decency." The front door opened before he could speak again. Roy stepped in, followed by 2 officers. The flash of their badges caught in the candlelight. Harold Bennett Roy said, his voice firm, official. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, identity theft, and financial coercion." Harold spun toward me, desperation creeping into his eyes. "Ellie, tell them, you don't want this. You can't live without me." I met his gaze, steady and cold. "You're right. I can't live without the truth. That's why I brought it home tonight." The officers cuffed him, the metal snapping around his wrists with finality. My son stood frozen, tears brimming in his eyes as the illusion of his father shattered. Martha covered her mouth, whispering, "Oh, Ellie." As Harold was led out the door, he turned back once more, trying to find the wife he thought would still pity him. But there was nothing left for him to find. "I trusted you," he said. I nodded slowly. "That was your first mistake." The rain outside had stopped. Blue and red lights from the patrol car swept across the living room, washing the walls in color. The guests murmured in disbelief as the sound of the door closing swallowed the noise. For a moment the house was perfectly quiet, peaceful even. I walked to the fireplace and turned off the television. The final frame of Harold and Rebecca kissing faded into darkness. "He thought he stole my future," I said softly, more to myself than anyone else. But all he really did was fund my freedom. The clock ticked on the mantel. The candles burned low. I poured myself a glass of wine and finally drank. It tasted like victory, dry clean and long overdue. The story traveled faster than I ever imagined. By morning, the arrest had already made it into the local paper. Community accountant exposes husband in $340,000 fraud case. The headline looked surreal, as if someone else's life had been printed above mine. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee steaming beside me, reading every line with the detached calm of a professional reviewing her own audit report. The details were exact, the fraudulent signatures, the fake doctor, the stolen funds, but they didn't capture the quiet parts, the months of gaslighting, the nights of pretending to forget, so I could survive long enough to remember everything. By noon, people began showing up. Martha was first clutching the newspaper, her eyes bright with both pride and anger. "I told the bank director the truth," she said. "I don't care if they fire me for it. They needed to hear what he did." She sat down across from me. "You're a damn legend, Ellie." I smiled faintly. "No, Martha, I'm just organized." Michael came later that afternoon. He didn't knock, just opened the door slowly, like he wasn't sure if he was still welcome. His eyes were red and his voice was small. "Mom, I'm sorry." I closed the folder I'd been sorting and looked up. "For what?" "For believing him," he said. "For thinking you were losing your mind." He took a deep breath. "I should have known better. You've always remembered everything." For a moment, the years between us dissolved, and I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to ask me to check his math homework, the one who trusted me to make the numbers add up. "It's all right," I said softly. "He fooled everyone, even himself." That evening, Roy called from the precinct. "He's confessed," he said. "Tried to shift blame, but the recordings sealed it. The DA's preparing the case. Rebecca's statement helped." I thanked him and hung up, sitting in the quiet until the ticking clock sounded like applause. Later that week, Rebecca came to see me. She looked smaller, somehow humbled, carrying a grocery store bouquet that trembled in her hands. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said at the door. "I just wanted to thank you for not turning this into vengeance. You could have destroyed me too. You destroyed yourself," I said gently, taking the flowers. "But you helped fix the damage, and that matters." We sat on the porch with tea, the evening cool and clear. "I testified yesterday," she said. "Told them everything, how he lied about you, how he said the money came from a trust fund. I hope it helps." "It does," I said. "It helps more than you know." Word spread quickly through the town. At the market, strangers nodded in quiet respect. At church, women I barely knew squeezed my hands, whispering that they admired my courage. It wasn't admiration I wanted, it was understanding. For every woman who'd ever been told she was crazy while someone rewrote her truth, I wanted this story to remind them that documentation is power, that sometimes the only weapon you need is proof. A week later, the news station called asking for an interview. I declined, but they aired the story anyway. They called me the accountant widow who caught a thief. I hated the word widow. Harold wasn't dead, just locked in a cell of his own making. But in a way, that word fit. The man I'd married had died long before the handcuffs closed. The police released a public statement confirming his confession and the charges. The numbers sounded clinical: 3 counts of wire fraud, 1 of identity theft, but behind each count was a night I'd stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, doubting my own memory. The judge denied him bail. The prosecutor mentioned restitution. They would recover most of my money, maybe all of it. But that wasn't the victory. The victory came quietly 2 days later when the bank manager called to apologize. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, "your diligence exposed not only his crimes but a loophole in our verification process. We're implementing new security protocols because of you." For the first time in months, I laughed. "Good," I said. "Let that be his legacy." Martha organized a small gathering at her house the following weekend. A few close friends, coffee, pastries, and a toast in my honor. To Eleanor, she said, raising her cup, "Proof that getting older doesn't mean getting weaker." Laughter filled the room, real laughter this time, not the kind that hides discomfort. I felt something uncoil in my chest, a release I hadn't realized I was holding. As we talked, I overheard snippets of conversation, neighbors, coworkers, people telling the story in their own words. Some called it revenge, others called it justice. I didn't correct them. Maybe it was both. The truth has a way of spreading on its own, like fire finding dry wood. A week later, an anonymous article appeared online titled "The Golden Wife Who Fought Back." It told my story in fragments, but what mattered most was the ending. If she could fight back at 70, what's stopping you? I didn't write it, but I couldn't have written it better myself. By the time summer rolled around, everyone in town knew the story. Women stopped me in the grocery aisles, saying they'd checked their joint accounts, changed passwords, made copies of deeds. The local senior center asked me to speak about financial safety. I said yes. If the story had to live, it should live usefully. On the night before Harold's preliminary hearing, I walked out to the garden. The lilies he'd given me had wilted in their vase. I tossed them into the compost, wiped my hands, and looked up at the stars. The air was clear, crisp, and almost kind. I thought of all the women who'd been told they were paranoid, dramatic, hysterical, every one of them sitting in silence, second-guessing the truth they already knew. So I spoke softly as if they could hear me. "You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're just waiting for the numbers to add up. If you believe that truth always finds its way to light, comment one. And if you think karma always comes for those who believe they're untouchable, hit like right now. Because no matter how carefully someone builds their lies, there's always one person willing to balance the books." The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, the scent of justice in progress. I sat in the second row as the judge read the sentence. Harold didn't look at me once. He stood there, shoulders slumped, in a wrinkled suit, eyes hollow from weeks of confinement. The man who used to fill rooms with his voice now spoke in fragments. "Your Honor, he said I never meant to hurt her. It was just money." The judge cut him off before the lie could finish. "It was never just money," she said. "It was trust. 5 years in state prison, full restitution, no contact order. The gavel struck once and it was done. I didn't cheer, I didn't cry, I just exhaled. Justice doesn't always roar, it sometimes signs its name quietly and moves on." Outside the courthouse, reporters waited microphones, ready faces, eager for drama. "Mrs. Bennett, do you have anything to say?" I paused on the steps, the spring sunlight washing over me. "Yes," I said. "If you think you can hide a lie behind love, remember this paper always remembers ink." Then I walked past them, the sound of cameras clicking like applause I hadn't asked for. Martha met me at the corner cafe afterward. She ordered pie for both of us, though neither of us was really hungry. "It's over," she said. "For him, maybe," I replied. "For me, it's just beginning." She frowned. "You're not going after anyone else, are you?" "No," I said with a small smile. "I'm going after peace." The following weeks unfolded quietly. The court returned partial restitution, $180,000, enough to rebuild what he'd tried to erase. I hired a contractor to repaint the house pale cream instead of the dull beige Harold had liked. I replaced the dining table where he'd been arrested with a smaller one round made of maple. The space felt lighter without his presence, as if the walls themselves were finally breathing. Rebecca testified again during the restitution hearing, calm and composed. When it ended, she approached me in the hallway. "I found a new job," she said softly, "in another town. No one there knows me." "Good," I said. "Start fresh. And this time earn your own life." She nodded, eyes shining. "You already taught me how." Michael visited often now. We planted herbs in the garden together, and he'd stay for dinner telling me stories about his kids. The tension between us had dissolved into something gentler. One evening he said, "You know, Mom, people keep asking what you'll do next. I tell them you're too busy being unstoppable." I laughed for the first time in a long while, really laughed. Unstoppable is a strong word, I said, but maybe accurate. A month later, I returned to work part-time at the community center, teaching a class called Financial Defense for Women. The first session was small, just 7 students, most of them older than me. I told them my story not as scandal, but as lesson. You can't stop people from lying, I said, but you can make sure they can't lie without leaving a receipt. The room erupted in soft laughter, and I felt something close to joy bloom quietly in my chest. One afternoon, a letter arrived from prison. The handwriting was familiar, though shakier. "Eleanor, I think of you every day. I hope one day you can forgive me." I folded it once, then again, and placed it in the fire. The flames took it without hesitation. Forgiveness wasn't owed. Peace already had it covered. By late summer, the garden was thriving. The lilies were gone, replaced by lavender and rosemary plants that grew stronger the more they were cut back. I'd begun writing again small essays about resilience and dignity. One of them was published in the local paper under the title, "The Arithmetic of Betrayal." The closing line read, "In the end, I didn't lose my savings. I gained interest in myself. Sometimes at dusk, I still sit by the window, tea in hand, watching the light fade across the yard. I think about how quiet the house is now, but it's a good quiet, the kind that belongs to no one but me. And when I see my reflection in the glass, I don't see a victim. I see a woman who balanced the books of her own life and came out even." The house was quiet again, but this time the silence didn't ache, it settled like something earned. I woke each morning to sunlight sliding across the hardwood floors, the smell of coffee drifting through a kitchen that finally belonged to me. There was no one to ask where the mail was, no voice questioning if I'd paid a bill, no clock set 10 minutes fast to make me doubt my own sense of time. I lived in the exact minute I wanted to live in, and that was freedom. It took months for the noise of the past to fade. At first, I'd still hear echoes. Harold's laugh down the hall, the shuffle of his slippers, the way he'd hum when he was lying. But memory has a way of softening when truth replaces fear. I learned to let the sounds come and go like wind through a half-open window. Some nights I'd wake up expecting to hear his car in the driveway, but it never came. And when it finally stopped crossing my mind, I knew I was free. My class at the community center grew faster than I expected. At first, it was just a handful of women retirees, widows, and a young mother saving for her first home, but word spread and soon the room filled every week. I taught them how to read a bank statement, how to recognize financial control, how to see patterns hidden in numbers. We laughed about the things we used to ignore, cried over the stories we shared, and celebrated each time someone found their strength again. One day, a woman in her 60s stayed behind after class. "I almost lost everything to my son-in-law," she said quietly. "But your story gave me the courage to check the accounts. You saved me." I smiled. "No," I told her. "You saved yourself. I just showed you the math." I started volunteering at the library, too, helping organize a resource shelf about financial independence and elder abuse. The librarian labeled it Eleanor's Corner. I pretended to be embarrassed, but secretly I loved it. The idea that my story could live on as warning and hope made every painful moment worthwhile. When the nonprofit women's group invited me to speak at their annual dinner, I almost said no. Standing on a stage had never been my kind of power. But the night came and I found myself under bright lights looking at hundreds of faces, young, old, fierce, afraid, hopeful. I told them the truth, plain and simple. "He didn't steal my money," I said. "He borrowed my trust and I collected interest when I took it back." The room broke into applause, not loud but steady, the kind that felt like understanding rather than noise. Afterward, people lined up to thank me, some with tears in their eyes. One woman whispered, "You turned survival into education." That night, walking home under the cool autumn sky, I thought about that phrase. Survival into education, pain into blueprint. That was all revenge really was, a lesson wrapped in fire. As winter settled in, I planted new bulbs in the garden. Tulips, this time bright and defiant. I'd read somewhere that tulips bloom best after enduring cold. Maybe people do too. The soil was cold and damp against my gloves, the air sharp with December. I worked slowly, my knees pressing into the earth. Somewhere nearby, a church bell rang the hour. Inside, the kettle whistled. I poured tea, sat by the window, and opened my old accounting ledger, not to balance finances this time, but to list what I had left: peace, purpose, freedom, and proof that even at 70 life could start over. I closed the book and whispered, assets stable. On Harold's sentencing anniversary, I visited the sea. The waves moved heavy and endless gray beneath the winter sky. I thought of the day I'd watched him kiss Rebecca at the resort, the same sea stretching behind them like a secret that refused to drown. I dropped a single coin into the tide, a habit from my younger days, and said quietly, debt paid. Driving home, I realized the revenge had stopped mattering somewhere along the way. The satisfaction wasn't in watching him fall, it was in standing tall afterward. Dignity isn't loud. It doesn't demand applause. It's a kind of silence that holds its head high while the world keeps talking. Now, when women ask me what I learned, I tell them this: trust is not blindness. Love should never require proof, but if someone asks you to stop checking the numbers, that's when you should start counting. And when they ask me if I ever forgave him, I smile and say I didn't need to. Forgiveness is for people still carrying the weight. I let it go. Sometimes I still find one of Harold's old receipts tucked between books or under furniture, a small relic of deception that somehow escaped the purge. I don't get angry. I just fold it once and drop it into the fire. Watching the paper curl feels less like destruction now and more like cleansing. The last time I saw Roy, he stopped by my class to drop off a brochure about financial protection laws. You've built something real here, he said, glancing around the crowded room. You turned your story into a system. That's the only kind of justice that lasts, I said. One that multiplies. That night I stood in the garden as the wind moved through the tulips I'd planted months ago. Their buds were just beginning to push through the frost, fragile but certain. The air smelled faintly of rain and soil. I thought about how far I'd come, about how the worst thing that ever happened to me had become the reason I was finally alive. The stars blinked faintly above, cold and bright. I raised my face to them and whispered to the quiet, "You were wrong, Harold. I didn't need you to take care of me. I just needed to remember who I was. And if you're listening to this wondering whether to stay quiet or to start counting, don't hesitate. Start counting, because the truth has a number, and when you find it, the world has to listen. If you believe that justice doesn't need to shout to be heard, comment 1 below. And if you believe dignity can't be stolen, only reclaimed, hit like right now. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't punishment, it's peace.